It's my pleasure to introduce Melanie Mitchell. Melanie's done work in both complex systems and AI that's included both making significant scientific contributions, but also helping to educate the broader public about these topics. She's received awards for both of those activities, including the Herbert Simon Award from the International Complex Systems Society, which is a pretty cool award to receive, and Schmidt Sciences Award for Science Communication. And I think in the field of AI, she's really somebody who I think is a counterpoint to the hype that often accompanies AI systems. You hear a lot from AI companies about all of the amazing things that these systems can do. And I think Melanie has a much more sort of realistic and pragmatic perspective that you'll see reflected in the talk about, trying to understand the capacities of AI systems and the limitations that they have that comes from a long career of exploring the capacities both of AI systems and thinking about the behavior of complex systems themselves. So I'll let Melanie take it away.
Great. Thank you. Well, thanks to Tom and all the organizers of this event for inviting me. So I come from the Santa Fe Institute. Some of you know about it. And we have a rule for talks, evening talks, which is that every time I say the word emergence, you need to take a drink. So AI is pretty good, right? Can now beat humans at most basic tasks, as was reported in Nature. And every time, we know that every time there's a new model that's released, like here, Gemini 3, the company lists the performance of the model on various famous benchmarks and compares that to the previous release of the previous model and their competition. So here, we see things like humanity's last exam, which is supposed to be the hardest exam ever. But of course, these machines are starting to get pretty good at it, and they're good at a lot of things. But the problem is that often benchmark performance doesn't predict capabilities in the real world. The real world is much more open-ended and much more complex than these benchmarks. And people have written about this extensively, that these benchmarks that we're using as proxies for intelligence or capabilities are really not reflecting what they are intended to. And there's a lot of issues of problems with benchmarks. The most simplest is data contamination. We don't know what these systems have been trained on. And they have obviously been trained on everything that the trainers can get their hands on, including everything that's been published, and that includes many kinds of tests. Subarao Kambampati at ASU has invoked the problem of approximate retrieval, where we have benchmark questions that are similar enough to questions in the training data of big models that they can interpolate and solve the benchmark problem without having the more general capability the benchmark is meant to test. Some of these benchmarks have exploitable spurious associations or shortcuts. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the talk. And typically, when AI people test their models, they test for accuracy on a benchmark. They don't really test for consistency, for robustness, or even for broader sort of out of distribution generalization. There's often a lack of construct validity. That is, you're trying to test, say, common sense reasoning, which is a kind of construct, and the test maybe doesn't reflect what that actual general capability is. And anthropomorphism, people love to test these systems on things like the bar exam, the SAT, IQ tests, what have you, assuming that if a machine gets a high quote unquote IQ score, that means the same thing as it would for a human. It's debated what it might mean for a human, but it's even more dubious what these things might mean for machines that can memorize large swaths of the entire internet. So benchmarking is broken. That's a quote from a prominent AI researcher. And people in cognitive science have started to notice that. And Mike Frank, developmental psychologist at Stanford, wrote this nice little piece called Baby Steps in Evaluating the Capacities of Large Language Models. And he said, imagine that you have contact with an alien intelligence. You might ask things like, do they have the same concepts as humans? Do they understand other minds? Can they reason? And he says developmental psychologists have been asking such questions for years about another kind of alien intelligence, human children, and suggests that methods from this research can help probe capacities of LLMs. Other people have written about using principles from research in cognitive science and applying them in AI. Anna Ivanova from Georgia Tech wrote a paper on this. There was a paper from a group of some of the people who are associated with diverse intelligences on using animal cognition to improve LLM evaluation. And other people have proposed using comparative cognition approaches in AI. So for what I read all these papers and abstracted some principles from them. I added a few principles of my own, and the total came out to about 6, which fits on one slide. I think a lot of these principles are pretty much common sense, sort of scientific method 101. But people like me who have degrees in computer science haven't studied experimental design. And those are the people who are publishing the papers on AI and who are running the big companies and showing those performances on benchmarks. So I think some of these will be pretty common sense to all of you, but imagine yourself as an AI researcher. Some of these might be a little bit novel. So the first one, be aware of your own cognitive bias towards anthropomorphism. This is a cognitive bias we all have. It's almost impossible to avoid. If you see a picture like this, well, looks like a happy baby, probably is a happy baby. But if you see a picture like this, that turns out to be a fear grimace in a monkey. They're not happy at all. And if you see a picture like this, it evokes sort of a emotional state by the human viewer, but it's a robot that is using various actuators and programmed in routines to mimic the expression on a human who is happy. We're all subject to the ELIZA effect. And we see that even today with the most sophisticated people who are thinking about AI. When people are now saying that systems like Claude is conscious, has feelings, has emotions, I believe that is a very, prototypical ELIZA effect that comes from fluent language and our response, our anthropomorphic biases to respond to these systems. Another one is to be skeptical of others and your own hypotheses. Well, that's something that's obviously we're supposed to do all the time, but in AI, people often don't do this. They don't design control experiments to look for possible alternative strategies that might produce the observed behavior. So I'm going to give a few examples of this from the psychology and comparative cognition literature, and then I'll move to issues in AI that involve this problem. So how many people here know about Clever Hans? Okay, not everybody, interestingly. I'm always surprised when people haven't heard of this, but it seems like it's kind of something that we learned when we were grad students, but not everybody hears about this. So Clever Hans was a horse who lived in the early 1900s in Germany and was hailed as the first thinking animal. The horse could do a lot of things. He could count the number of people in the audience and show the results by tapping. You can see him tapping his hoof on a platform there. He could perform arithmetic, read the clock, and so on, do all kinds of really amazing tricks. And so he would tap his hoofs to indicate the answer. And people studied Clever Hans. They were suspicious. They were suspicious of the trainer. Clever Hans' trainer was giving him cues that nobody could see, and that therefore they did some experiments to show that that wasn't the case. And it turned out that the majority of scientists, including a commission that the German government drafted to study Clever Hans, were quite convinced that animals like Clever Hans were able to think in a human-like way. But of course, Clever Hans is a classic example of this problem of neglecting to do control experiments. In 1907, the psychologist Oscar Funkst actually did some control experiments, and he found that Clever Hans couldn't answer a question if the questioner did not know the answer. Also could not answer the question if he couldn't see the face of the questioner. And the conclusion was that the horse didn't have the claimed capacities for math, but was a genius actually at something much more useful for a horse, to read subtle facial expressions in order to know when to stop tapping. So he was using cues from the questioner or the audience that he could read that were very unconscious and yet would tell him when to stop tapping. So that's actually a different kind of genius. So animals can think, but just not in the way that these people were imagining for Clever Hans. Another example of this is a famous set of experiments on moral reasoning in infants. And some of you who are familiar with the developmental literature will know about these experiments. So the first paper by a group at Yale at the time proposed that infants, pre-verbal infants, were able to make moral judgments, basically that they could tell if an activity was pro-social or anti-social. And here's the scenario. You have a little puppet show. These are actual wooden puppets that were made and were controlled by the experimenters. And there's a helper scenario and a hinderer scenario. So here's how the helper scenario goes. You have this little circle puppet with googly eyes, and it's climbing up a hill or trying to climb up the hill, and it's failing. And suddenly the helper comes along and pushes it up to the top of the hill. Okay, so lovely, nice pro-social behavior. Then we have the hinderer behavior, which is similar, except that the little circle trying to get up to the top of the hill is hindered by this nasty, mean square and pushes it down to the bottom. And babies were given the choice of choosing one of the puppets, either the helper or the hinderer. And infants robustly chose the helper over the hinderer. Okay, so the claim was that young infants can evaluate others based on their social behavior. But another group did another study a few years later on this, in which they said they looked at very carefully at the videos of this puppet show and said, wait, there's a little confounding behavior, which is that on the helper condition, the little, after the square is pushed up to the top of the, the circle is pushed up to the top of the hill, it does a little bounce. And what about that bounce? Maybe it doesn't do that bounce on the hinderer conditions. So here's an example of the experiment that they did. They said, let's try the bounce on the top, the bounce on the helper trials, the bounce at the bottom on the hinderer trials, and the bounce do both in another condition. So here's the bounce at the bottom condition. So watch carefully. We have, now we have a different color of circle. And the hinderer comes down and pushes it down to the bottom, and it does a little bounce. You get that? Okay. So, and here, then the infants were allowed to choose on each trial the characters, and on the top trial, they chose the helper. On the bottom trial, the bounce on the bottom trial, they chose the hinderer, and on the both trial, it was even. So the conclusion was that now this calls into question the view that infants enter this world with an innate moral compass. So this is, there was another paper, I don't think I have it here, but that the original researchers followed up with and said, wait a minute, the googly eyes weren't looking up at the top of the hill, so there was no goal orientation, sort of. And there was a bunch of arguments that went back and forth until there was recently a paper that tried to replicate these results across like a whole bunch of different labs, and they were not able to do it. So anyway, I don't know where it stands, but the point is not what to say whether infants have an innate moral compass or not, but just that this kind of research, as we saw in many of the talks today, involves a high level of creativity in the creation and testing of alternative explanations. And this is true not only for infant cognition, but for animal cognition, and I believe also for machine cognition. So this is something that maybe to you is, okay, yeah, of course, but it's not something that is routinely done in the AI world. It requires also replicating and further testing other people's and your own work, which is also something that's not often done in the AI world, surprisingly. So another principle is to analyze failure types. Those often give more insight than success, and to also embrace negative results. Okay, this is obviously controversial. There's a fun paper by a developmental psychologist who said, a comparative psychologist who says that it's often when you publish a paper that is negative, it's called a killjoy. It's not as exciting as when, as she said, octopi or birds are unexpectedly human-like. Those make headlines. Killjoy explanations don't. So there's some kind of publication bias. Other people have said now we should really embrace this in machine learning, because in the machine learning world, it's even more skewed. The only results really that get published in important conferences are positive results. But people have written about this. There's even a journal of negative results. Has anyone published in that? I don't know. It's not very high impact, unfortunately. But I was really pleased. I gave a version of this talk as a keynote at the big NeurIPS conference last year. And this year, they actually introduced a negative results track. I'm taking total credit for this, but I thought that was very cool. Here's something that people in AI rarely do: design novel variations and stimuli to test robustness and generalization. Well, here's an example from my own work, okay, of this. There was a paper published in 2023 from a group at UCLA who were studying analogy in large language models, and they claimed that large language models had emergent, take a drink, abilities to do analogical reasoning. And they showed that GPT-3, so this is going way back, was better than humans, or on average at least, on several domains of analogy making. And on the domains that were humans were better, GPT-4, the next model, was actually better than humans. And their conclusion was that GPT-3 and 4 displays a capacity for zero-shot analogical reasoning across a broad range of tasks. One problem with this is that there was probably some data contamination, because some of these benchmarks for analogical reasoning were older. But also there was no testing for robustness. Here's some examples of analogy tasks that were given. These are simple letter string analogy problems due to Doug Hofstadter, something that I actually worked on a long time ago, where you have a transformation between one string and another, like ABCD goes to ABCE, make the same transformation to IJKL. And there's a lot of different ways you can do transformations in this little idealized world. Another one is to change a double letter to a single letter, or to fix a sequence like AGCD goes to ABCD, so IJWL goes to IJKL. And so GPT-3 was better than UCLA psychology undergrads at this task, this kind of task. But with my colleague Martha Lewis, we said, well, how robust is this kind of analogical reasoning that these models are doing? And so what we did was we created what some people have called counterfactual tasks. So we say, imagine a counterfactual world in which the alphabet is a little different. Here, we've switched the letters M and E. Now we translate one of the tasks from the original benchmark into this new world. And we say, okay, MVGHI goes to MFGHI. And you can kind of see up here, MFGHI in this world is a sequence in the alphabet. Now do the same thing to the FGLIJ. Well, it's like a fix the sequence, and so it would be FGHIJ. Okay, that's one variation. The other variation is now we have a counterfactual world where the alphabet has symbols instead of letters. And we have an ordering of the symbols, and we translate tasks into that little new alphabet. And we found that we tested humans and various GPT models, and we found that across the number of letters permuted, going from 0 to 20, and at the end, the symbol alphabet, humans didn't really change that much in their accuracy. Sorry, I shouldn't be talking. Whereas GPT models went down much more, and especially with the symbol alphabet, they were really tanked in their performance. So, often when I give talks on AI evaluation, people will say, well, wait a minute, I just tried that problem here in my seat on GPT 5.4, and it does it perfectly. But I just want to say that's not the point here. The point is not whether the next model is going to be able to solve these tasks, but the point is that any experimental evaluation should follow these principles. So now it turns out every time a model, you publish something about something a model can't do, in the next iteration it can do it. I don't know whether that's because it's becoming more generally intelligent or that they're specifically patching certain kinds of things, who knows. But it's important to do these kinds of evaluations. The fifth principle is to consider performance versus competence. This is something that's quite well-known distinction in psychology and linguistics. The idea that performance is what you can show you can do, competence is what you actually can do. Sometimes you can possess a capacity but can't demonstrate it for various reasons. Like if you can't talk and I ask you a question, you can't respond, but you might have the underlying capability. Sometimes it's the other way around. You show some ability that seems quite general, but it turns out not to be general. You can do the performance, but you don't have the underlying capability. So this is something that showed up on my group's work on the abstraction and reasoning corpus in studying humans and large language models. So the abstraction and reasoning corpus, how many people here are familiar with that corpus? Okay, not that many. It's a popular thing now in AI. It was invented by Francois Chollet, who was a Google engineer who since has left and started his own company to solve this corpus. He wrote this pretty good paper called On the Measure of Intelligence, which I recommend. And his idea was that he developed this benchmark of visual puzzles or pattern recognition puzzles that were meant to encode so-called core knowledge, the idea that of people like Liz Spelke and Susan Gelman, that we humans are born with certain kinds of knowledge, like the world is divided into objects. Objects interact in certain ways, and objects have certain kinds of properties. There's certain kinds of topological relations, like some things are inside other things, and other things are outside other things, and things like that. Whether they're innate, these things are innate or not, they're certainly quite basic to our understanding of the physical world. And Cholet used this to design some of his tasks. So the way that the task works is that you have a small number of demonstrations of one grid of colors changing into another grid. And then you have to figure out what the rule is and apply it to a new input. So you can see here, there's some kind of object. It has a kind of orientation. That's another kind of core concept. You extend it in the direction of its orientation to an edge. So those are more core concepts. Using a color, that's the color at the bottom of the pyramid, whatever you want to call it. And most people find this pretty easy to say what should happen in the test input. Another example from this corpus is slightly more challenging. This is a shape invariance task where you have to figure out a certain kind of shape is colored a certain color, like shapes that look like U's are colored pink, and shapes that look like H's, if you will, are colored red, and so on, no matter how big they are, no matter what orientation they're in, and so on. So Cholet designed 1,000 of these tasks. He published 800 of them. He kept 200 of them as a private evaluation set. And what happened? Slides stopped moving. Okay, sorry. He and his collaborators offered, back in 2024, a $600,000 prize for a program that can exceed 85% accuracy on one of the private test sets. So that's a pretty good incentive. I don't know why it was 85% was the threshold, because people actually didn't do that well, at least the people who were on Amazon Mechanical Turk or Prolific who were tested. But anyway, there you are. But the problem is, we process these visually, right? Machines, if I gave that image to a machine, like one of the new GPT models, it would have a hard time parsing it. So the vision abilities of these models, at least in these abstract domains, hasn't caught up with the language abilities. So the way that these tasks were given to these machines was in a textual format where each grid was given as an array of numbers that had a coding from colors to numbers. And you would say, okay, here's example 1, the input, the output. Here's example 2, input, output. Now I'm going to give you the test. And back in 2024, which in AI days is a really long time ago, here's how the top scorers did on this. They all used large language models as part of their solution, but they did various bells and whistles on them. There's like a time limit. You can't just like run your machine so that it uses up, billions of tokens. There's a time and money limit that the organizers put on this contest. So nobody won, and humans on Amazon Mechanical Turk were measured at about 64% on a different, they couldn't access the private test set, but they used a different evaluation set. So humans, I don't know how incentivized humans were to try hard, but some of these tasks are kind of hard. So I can imagine humans not being that excited about trying to think very hard. But right after that, OpenAI released their O3 reasoning model, and it got a breakthrough high score. So this was back in 2024 when these things weren't so efficient. There's reasoning effort, that's like how many tokens it's allowed to put out in its reasoning trace. And in the high setting, where each task costs about $3,000 to solve, so I just gave you 2 tasks, that's $6,000. It got 88% correct with 5.7 billion tokens. So like, I don't know how many books that is of reasoning trace for the 100 tasks in the data set. So, but still, it's doing incredibly well. And the ARC Prize Foundation said that it's a breakthrough, a qualitative shift in AI capabilities. Okay. But our question in my group was like, okay, these models are doing incredibly well, but we know these problems with benchmarks. To what extent are these models actually grasping these concepts that the benchmark was meant to test? That was really our question. Or are they using some kind of weird shortcuts or, what you might call an alien kind of reasoning? So to understand this, we used a slightly different data set that we had designed called Concept Arc, which tries to make tasks that are focused on a particular core concept. So here are some concepts that we looked at. And what we tried to do is for each of these concepts, we had designed 30 different tasks that were variations on a theme, but they focused on, as much as possible, on a single concept. So we had about 480 tasks total. So and we tried to make them as relatively simple for humans. Here's an example. So I have 3 demonstrations and a test. I think people get pretty fast that it's like you remove the top and bottom object. So this is getting to the concept of top and bottom. Okay, here's another one. This is a one-dimensional task. This might be a little trickier. Here you're extracting, I don't know if you can see it well enough, but here you're extracting the color that's at the center of the one-dimensional grid. Okay, and to test this, we evaluated AI reasoning models, but we evaluated them the same way that the ARC Prize evaluated them, but we also did one more thing, which is we asked the model to give the rule it used to solve the task, to say in natural language what rule it is. I'll tell you in a minute why we might believe or not believe what it says. We also asked humans the same thing. And so we asked, is the output grid correct? And is the stated rule correct as it was intended? Is the stated rule correct in that it captures, it actually, if you run it like a program, does it actually correctly describe the demonstrations, but it doesn't actually talk about the intended abstractions? Or is it incorrect? So here, to ask if the output grid was correct, we ran this on 3 reasoning models, O3, Claude Sonnet 4, and Gemini 2.5 Pro. Already, they're way beyond this now. But we found that O3 actually did do better than humans down here, although we tried also in the visual modality, in which these models were just horrible. Okay, they were great in this textual modality, terrible in this visual modality. But then we looked at the rules. Okay, so take this task. Here's what one of the humans in our study said. They said, use the same grid size as the input. There will be multiple objects. Simply remove the top object and the bottom object only. And we rated that as correct as intended. That was what was intended in the task by the designers. And also that correct over there on the right means that it got the correct output also. Claude said something similar, remove the topmost and bottommost colored regions. That was also correct. Gemini said something was more verbose and was a little bit weird, okay? It said, identify all connected shapes, blah, blah, blah. Sort them first by their size, number of cells in ascending order, then by their color value. Namely, it was using this coding for colors, which was not intended to be used as a relevant feature. But it used those, and then it said, remove the 2 shapes that come first in this sorted list. It turned out that that was accidentally correct, described the demonstrations correctly. But it didn't get the right output, at least what we considered the right output. Okay, and O3 just said something that was wrong. It said, delete every component having the minimum size, which is wrong for demonstration 2, because there's 3 things that have the minimum size and only 2 of them are deleted. So it just was wrong. So those are the three classes we sorted these rules into. We had to do this manually. So this was a lot of time to read through all these rules because we tried doing this automatically, asking an LLM to say, is this rule correct or not? But they couldn't do that, at least not at that time. Here we have humans saying, select the color that's in the middle of the input. Only output that color is a 1x1 grid. Good. O3 says something similar, except it's slightly more nerdy. It says the center thing is it describes it as the index of floor n over 2 for odd length. And these things are kind of want to get all cases right. Okay, that was true. But then Claude here found this weird rule, which was the values that appear with minimum frequency, assort them in ascending order. That's ascending in terms of this color scale that is supposed to be arbitrary, and return the second smallest value if multiple values exist. And it turned out that was correct. It was unintended, but it was also got the correct answer by chance. And Gemini came up with something quite similar to the Claude one. So, if you look at these tasks, there's an infinite number of possible rules that would produce the right answer. You can come up with all kinds of crazy things, but humans almost always agree because humans are using these so-called core knowledge concepts. That's what's salient to us. That's not necessarily what's salient to machines, but the corpus was meant to test the ability to recognize and use these core knowledge concepts. And so according to what the corpus was meant to test, the machines are getting the right answer often for the wrong reason. Okay. We also looked at the wording of the rules, and we asked to what extent are they, well, we asked first, to what extent are they faithful to the grids they generate? Like, why do we believe these rules that they generate? And we found that the rule that an AI system will generate correctly describes the output grid that it gets, whether it's correct or not, 95% of the time, which is impressive. So we believe that the rules that it was stating were pretty well aligned with like the actual output that it was giving. That wasn't always true, but 95% of the time. So here I'm going to show you a plot that shows this rule evaluation on all of the 480 tasks. All right, so this is the percent of correct output grids, and this is the percent of incorrect output grids for each model. Within the correct output grids, we look at the green segment as where it actually did come up with a rule that matched the intended concepts or abstractions. So those were the correct and intended. These were the ones where it was correct, meaning that the rule did describe the demonstrations correctly, but it might have been some really Rube Goldberg type of thing like that involved multiplying values of colors, and we had some pretty out there ones where it really didn't get the thing that the humans would get. And here we got the correct output, but the incorrect rule. So it's kind of getting the correct output even though it got the rule wrong. So you can see that, and there were some rules that were unclear or missing. It said it couldn't come up with a rule. All right, so this is a case where the performance, which is about 77%, you can see the accuracy, is overstating the competence in terms of what the benchmark is meant to test. The performance or accuracy is greater than the ability to capture the intended abstractions. So performance is higher than competence. For the visual inputs, again, here are the percent of correct outputs, here are the percent of incorrect outputs. They're incorrect on almost most of the cases. But you can see that in some cases they get the incorrect output, in actually quite a lot of cases, but the rule did capture the abstractions. They got the right rule, but they weren't able to implement it correctly for various reasons, like they got the dimensions of the grid wrong or something. And here's a case where the performance is less than the competence, that performance underestimates competence. So you could get it both directions. And then we also have our human study was actually done that was for a different project, and we were using the data, but we found that the data didn't collect, when the human was incorrect, we didn't collect the rules. Also humans had a lot of non-compliant rules, like they would say something like, we would say, how did you solve, what was the rule you used to solve this task? And they would say none, or, something like that. We weren't paying them enough to get the right answer. But you can see, so it's suggestive, it's not complete, but you can see that of the ones that actually we could evaluate, almost all of them were of this correct intended green kind. And we can show that a little bit more clearly here, where we actually look at the some word frequency statistics. So we collected terms from the human and AI generated rules that were related to objects, and then words that were related to grids. So one of the most important core knowledge systems is objectness. You describe the world in terms of objects. So we looked at words that were related to objects, and here are some of them. These are the kinds that we found in the rules that were generated by humans and AI systems. We also looked at words that were more domain specific, words about grids like cell, pixel, row, column, etc. And here's what we found. We've computed the proportion of rules containing at least one term for each group. And we found for humans were much more likely to describe things in terms of objects, not surprisingly, than these models. And humans were very unlikely to describe things in terms of grid type vocabulary, where models were much more likely to do that. And we found that that was true even when we separated into like the different types of rules, like the human, even when the humans were correct, but not capturing the right abstraction for the rule, they still talked about objects. Whereas even when we got the right rule from AI models, they were still very likely to talk about more domain-specific features. So then we said, well, what about the original, what's called ARC-AGI benchmark, the one that you could get $600,000 for solving? And we said, well, we saw in our benchmark that, it was inappropriately using the numerical code. So we said, well, what if instead of the numerical code, we try the problems with a different code inspired by the previous project where we replace the code with symbols. So it's just a translation from numbers to symbols. And now we give O3 and or more recent models this symbol version. And Cholet had expressly stated that the encoding was meant to be arbitrary. It wasn't meant to be a property that should be used. But we found that here's the here's what we got for GPT 5.2 on using the numerical code. And when we use a symbol code, it goes down considerably. It goes from 78% to 64% accuracy. And when there's another data set, ARC-AGI2, which is supposed to be harder, it is actually a lot harder. And there, these models don't do as well, but they go from 23% accuracy to 17%. So there is some kind of overfitting to these specific codes. So the take-home message, high accuracy on a benchmark doesn't necessarily mean that they recognize and reason with the abstractions intended by the creators of the task. why does this matter? When I talk about this with AI folks, they say, well, why should we care how the machine does it? As long as it gets the right answer, right? That's all we care about. Well, in some cases, sure, we want AI systems to think differently from us. And this is something that we saw, for instance, in AlphaFold, protein structure prediction system. It was able to find correlations in the data that allowed it to predict the structure of proteins more accurately than anything before. We don't know what those correlations are. We don't understand the concepts it used. They're probably quite alien, but yet we can use the results. But in some cases, we want AI to understand the world in the way that we humans do when we're interacting with it in the human world. So this is an example that I liked from a while ago. This is some guy who's driving his Tesla using self-driving software on the road, and he tweets at Elon Musk, my car kept slamming on the brakes in this area with no stop sign. After a few drives, I noticed the billboard. And here's the billboard. Okay, so the car's seen this billboard, which is some ad for something, I don't know what, and it says stop. And it has a police officer holding up a stop sign. And humans, I think most humans would not see that as a real stop sign. They would understand the context, but the car didn't have the same kinds of concepts of the world that we do. And people actually can use this on the streets of San Francisco to fool the robo-taxis, so you can have fun out there. We need these systems to think the way we do for assessing trustworthiness, safety, interpretability, and so on. Okay, and most people in AI just look at accuracy on benchmarks, but that might mask a lot of things like exploitation of shortcuts, unhuman-like reasoning. And so we really need to align concepts between humans and AI systems in order to predict how the systems will generalize in the real world. On the other hand, sometimes low accuracy can mask competence, and so accuracy alone is not enough. We really have to look at other issues. All right, so my sixth principle is simple. It's to replicate and build on others' results, to use converging evidence across multiple experimental tasks. That's something all of you who work in developmental or comparative psych know very well. But if you've ever submitted a paper to an AI conference, any of you submitted papers to NeurIPS or ICML or any of those, this is the kind of review you get. It lacks novelty. It's incremental. This is a quote from a review of my own paper. And that's sort of like we're just actively discouraged to do this. And I would say that contra to this reviewer number 2, the hallmark of good science is the replication of prior findings and incremental extension of prior work. I think incremental science is underrated. All right, so that's it. I want to thank many collaborators, including Jacob, who was here yesterday, but isn't here. But anyway, this has been a great collaboration, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.